The deaf slave no one wanted, until he felt the fire vibrating through the ground. The auction block stood in the center of Charleston's market square, worn smooth by decades of human transactions. August heat pressed down on the crowd like a physical weight, making the air shimmer above the cobblestones. Samuel stood at the back of the platform, his eyes fixed on nothing in particular. At 23 years old, he had learned to read the world through vibrations and movement, through the subtle shifts in air pressure that announced danger or opportunity. Born deaf on a Virginia plantation, he had been sold 3 times already. Each master found him less valuable than anticipated. A slave who couldn't hear orders was considered damaged goods, unreliable, potentially dangerous. The auctioneer's mouth moved rapidly, his face reddening with effort. Samuel felt the vibrations of his shouting through the wooden platform beneath his bare feet. The crowd's energy changed, became restless. He recognized this feeling. No one was bidding. Again. The morning sun climbed higher, and Samuel's shadow shortened on the wood. His skin, dark as polished mahogany, glistened with sweat. He had long ago stopped hoping for a kind master. He simply hoped for one who would feed him adequately and not beat him more than necessary. Then he felt it. A different vibration, heavier footsteps, deliberate and measured. A man pushed through the crowd, and Samuel could sense the way others moved aside for him, not from respect, but from something else. Fear, perhaps, or unease. The man wore a black suit despite the heat, his face pale beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He raised his hand, and Samuel felt the change in the auctioneer's rhythm. A bid had been placed. 3 minutes later, Samuel belonged to Thaddeus Crane, owner of Blackwater Plantation, 40 miles inland where the marshes began. As Crane's wagon rolled away from Charleston, Samuel watched the city disappear behind them. He had learned to observe everything, to compensate for what he couldn't hear. The other slaves in the wagon, 7 of them, didn't speak to each other. That was unusual. Slaves always talked when masters weren't listening, but these people sat in absolute silence, their eyes vacant, their hands folded in their laps like corpses waiting for burial. The landscape changed as they traveled. The cultivated fields gave way to twisted live oaks draped in Spanish moss, then to wetlands where the water reflected the sky like black glass. The air grew thick with moisture and the smell of decay. Samuel felt the wagon wheels sink into softer ground, the vibrations becoming muted and strange. Blackwater Plantation appeared as the sun began to set, a massive house of colonial design, but its white paint had peeled away in long strips, revealing grey wood beneath. The slave quarters stood to the east, a collection of decrepit cabins that leaned at odd angles, as if trying to pull away from the main house. Crane stopped the wagon, but didn't look at his new acquisitions. He simply pointed toward the quarters and walked away. The other slaves moved like automatons, climbing down and trudging toward the cabins. Samuel followed, his feet sinking into mud that felt unnaturally warm. Inside the quarters, he found a space on the floor of one cabin. The other occupants ignored him completely. That night, Samuel lay awake, feeling vibrations he couldn't identify, rhythmic disturbances in the earth, coming from somewhere beneath the plantation, not natural, not footsteps, something else. Morning came without roosters crowing, which Samuel only realized because the slaves around him began to move at first light. They filed out silently and walked to the fields. Samuel followed, watching, learning. The work was cotton-picking, familiar enough, but the field itself was wrong. The plants grew in irregular patches, and between them the soil was stained dark, almost black, not from good earth, but from something else. Something that made Samuel's stomach turn even though he couldn't identify why. Throughout the day he noticed patterns. Every hour, one of the older slaves would stop working, stand perfectly still for exactly 60 seconds, then return to work. Their faces during those moments became completely blank, as if something had left their bodies temporarily. That night, Samuel felt it again. The vibrations from below, stronger now. He pressed his palm to the cabin floor, trying to understand. The rhythm was too regular to be natural, too purposeful. It felt like machinery, but not quite. Like something trying to mimic machinery. He looked around the cabin. 12 slaves shared this space, but none of them seemed to notice or care about the vibrations. They sat or lay in silence, their eyes open but unseeing. Samuel realized with growing horror that he might be the only one who could feel what was happening beneath Blackwater Plantation. On his third day, Samuel saw the first disappearance. A young woman named Ruth had arrived on the same wagon as him. She had been assigned to work in the main house. Samuel watched from the fields as she carried water buckets toward the back entrance. She disappeared around the corner of the house. That was normal. What wasn't normal was that she never came back around. Samuel waited, watching. An hour passed, 2 hours. Ruth never reappeared. That evening, when the slaves returned to the quarters, Ruth's space in the women's cabin remained empty. No one mentioned her. No one seemed to notice she was gone. Samuel's hands trembled as he ate his evening ration of cornmeal mush. He looked around at the other slaves, searching for any sign of concern, of awareness. Nothing. They ate mechanically, their movements synchronized in a way that made Samuel's skin crawl. He was surrounded by people, but he had never felt more alone. That night, the vibrations from below intensified. Samuel pressed his entire body against the floor, trying to decode the message the earth was sending. The rhythm changed, became more complex, and then he felt something else. A scream, not heard, but felt. A vibration of such intensity, such agony, that it could only be human suffering transmitted through the ground itself. He sat up sharply, looking around the cabin. No one else reacted. They slept or stared at the ceiling with empty eyes. Samuel's heart hammered against his ribs. He had to understand what was happening. He had to find a way to warn someone, anyone. But who? The other slaves were like ghosts, present but not really alive. And Crane, Samuel had learned long ago that masters were rarely the solution to a slave's problems. They were usually the cause. The next morning, Samuel broke the plantation's unspoken rule. He approached another slave during breakfast, a man named Isaac, who had kind eyes and scars on his back that told stories of resistance. Samuel touched Isaac's shoulder, pointed to the ground, then made a gesture of questioning. Isaac's eyes focused on Samuel for just a moment, and in that moment, Samuel saw something. Recognition, fear, a warning. Isaac's lips moved, and though Samuel couldn't hear the words, he could read the shape of them. Run! Then Isaac's eyes went blank again, his moment of awareness extinguished like a candle in water. Samuel stepped back, his blood turning cold. Whatever was happening at Blackwater Plantation, it could reach into people's minds, control them, silence them. But it couldn't reach him. His deafness, his isolation from the world of sound had become his protection. He was invisible to whatever force operated beneath their feet. That day, Samuel worked with new purpose. He observed everything, memorized patterns. At midday, Crane appeared at the edge of the field. He stood motionless for 10 minutes, his pale face expressionless, his eyes scanning the slaves like a farmer examining livestock. His gaze passed over Samuel without interest. The deaf slave, the broken tool, beneath notice. But Samuel noticed him, noticed the way Crane's clothes always seemed too clean despite the plantation's decay, noticed the way he never sweated, even in the crushing heat, noticed that he always appeared after the vibrations from below changed their pattern. Crane wasn't just the master of Blackwater Plantation, he was connected to whatever lurked beneath it. As the sun began to set, Samuel watched another slave disappear. This time it was Jacob, a man in his 40s with grey threading through his hair. He had been sent to repair a fence near the tree line. Samuel saw him walk toward the woods, saw him kneel to examine a broken post. Then Jacob simply stood up and walked deeper into the trees. He didn't run, didn't look back. Just walked with that same mechanical precision Samuel had seen in all the other slaves. Walked until the shadows swallowed him completely. That night Samuel made his decision. He would go beneath the plantation. He would find the source of the vibrations, the source of the disappearances, the source of whatever evil had turned living people into empty shells. His deafness had always been his curse, the thing that made him less valuable, less human in the eyes of those who could hear. Now it would be his weapon. He waited until the deepest part of night, when even the most vigilant overseer would be asleep. The moon was dark, which made his task more difficult, but also provided cover. Samuel crept from the cabin, his bare feet making no sound on the damp earth. He moved toward the main house, following the strongest vibrations. They led him to the cellar doors, heavy wooden panels set into the ground at an angle, locked with an iron chain. But the chain was old, its links weakened by rust and moisture. Samuel found a rock and worked at the weakest link, grinding away at the corroded metal. It took an hour, his fingers bleeding, his arms aching. Finally, the link broke. The chain slithered to the ground with a series of dull clinks that Samuel felt more than heard. He lifted the cellar door, and a wave of warm, fetid air rolled over him. The smell was indescribable, rot and chemicals and something else, something that didn't belong in the natural world. The vibrations intensified, their rhythm now a frantic pulse that made Samuel's teeth ache. He descended the stone steps into absolute darkness. The walls were damp, slick with something that wasn't water. Samuel kept one hand on the wall, following the vibrations deeper into the earth. The passage opened into a larger chamber, and even in the darkness, Samuel could sense its vast emptiness. He could feel the air moving differently, could sense open space around him. Then he saw the light. Not fire or candles, but something else, a pale greenish glow that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. As his eyes adjusted, Samuel's mind struggled to comprehend what he was seeing. The chamber was enormous, carved from the living rock beneath the plantation. But it wasn't empty. The walls were lined with alcoves, and in each alcove stood a person, or what used to be a person. They were slaves, Samuel realized, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. They stood perfectly still, their eyes open and glowing with that same sickly light. Their mouths hung open, and from their throats came a low, constant vibration. This was what Samuel had been feeling. Not machinery, not something trying to mimic machinery. It was human voices, human bodies, being used as instruments for something incomprehensible. Samuel's legs nearly gave out. He wanted to run, to climb those stairs and keep running until he reached Charleston, until he reached anywhere that wasn't here. But he couldn't move, because in the center of the chamber stood Ruth, the young woman who had disappeared days ago. She was different now. Her skin had taken on a waxy, translucent quality, and her eyes glowed brighter than the others. She turned toward Samuel, her movements fluid but wrong, like a puppet whose strings were being pulled by someone who had never quite mastered the art. Her mouth opened, and even though Samuel couldn't hear her speak, he could feel the vibrations of her words through the stone beneath his feet. They were words, but not in any language he knew. They were patterns, frequencies, commands written in sound and sensation. Then Samuel understood. Blackwater Plantation wasn't just a place of slavery, it was a laboratory. Crane, or whatever Crane had become, was conducting experiments. He was learning how to control human beings, not through chains and whips, but through sound, through frequencies that could rewrite thoughts, suppress will, turn people into instruments of their own oppression. And it was working. The slaves of Blackwater didn't need chains. They didn't need overseers with guns. They simply needed to hear the right sounds, feel the right vibrations, and they would do anything. walk into the woods and vanish, stand in the fields until they drop dead, descend into this chamber and take their place among the chorus of the damned. But Samuel couldn't hear. The frequencies that controlled the others passed through him without effect. He was immune, invisible, an anomaly in Crane's perfect system, and that made him dangerous. Ruth's head tilted at an unnatural angle, her glowing eyes fixed on Samuel. She raised one hand, pointing at him, and the vibrations from the other slaves intensified. Samuel felt it through his feet, through his bones, through his very teeth. They were trying to reach him, trying to find the frequency that would make him like them. But there was no frequency. There was only silence. The same silence that had been with him since birth, the same silence that had made him worthless in the eyes of every master who had ever owned him. Samuel turned and ran. He climbed the stairs 3 at a time, his bleeding hands slipping on the stone. Behind him, he felt the vibrations changing, becoming discordant, angry. The entire plantation seemed to shudder, as if the earth itself was waking from a nightmare. He burst through the cellar doors into the night air, gasping, his mind reeling from what he had seen. But he couldn't stop. Not yet. He ran to the slave quarters, shaking each person he found, slapping faces, trying desperately to wake them from their trance. Nothing worked. Their eyes remained vacant, their bodies limp and unresponsive. Samuel's hands trembled with rage and despair. These were his people, and they were being destroyed in a way worse than any physical torture. Their very souls were being stolen, their humanity extracted like cotton from a bowl. Then he remembered. Fire. Fire created vibrations that couldn't be controlled, couldn't be tuned to any frequency. Fire was chaos, pure and simple. Samuel ran to the kitchen building, where embers still glowed in the massive hearth. He grabbed a burning log, feeling its heat, feeling the way it trembled and cracked in his hands. He carried it to the main house, to the place where Crane slept, where the heart of this evil resided. The wood of Blackwater Plantation was old and dry, the white paint peeling away like dead skin. It caught fire immediately, flames racing up the walls with terrifying speed. Samuel moved to the slave quarters next, setting fire to each cabin, the flames driving out the occupants who stumbled into the night, still entranced, but at least out of their prison. The vibrations from below changed again. They became frantic, irregular, almost panicked. Samuel could feel the entity beneath the plantation writhing, its careful system of control disrupted by the chaotic frequencies of fire. The flames cast dancing shadows across the grounds, and in their light, Samuel saw Crane emerge from the burning house. But it wasn't Crane anymore. The skin had begun to slough off his face, revealing something beneath that wasn't human. Wasn't anything Samuel had ever seen or felt. It was formed from vibrations made solid, from sound given substance. An entity that had learned to wear human flesh, that had built this plantation as a trap, a way to harvest human beings and study the sounds of their suffering. The creature moved toward Samuel, its stolen body falling apart with each step. Samuel stood his ground, holding the burning log like a weapon. Around him the other slaves began to wake. The fire's vibrations, wild and unpredictable, were breaking through the entity's control. Samuel saw awareness return to their eyes, saw horror and understanding dawn on their faces as they realized what had been done to them. The creature reached for Samuel, its hands extending into tendrils of solidified sound. But fire is democratic. It burns everything equally, asking no permission, respecting no authority. Samuel thrust the burning log forward, and when it made contact with the creature, the flames spread across its form like water finding its level. The thing that had been Thaddeus Crane screamed, though Samuel couldn't hear it. The vibration was so powerful that the ground beneath his feet cracked and splintered. The other slaves ran. They scattered into the night, into the marshes, heading for Charleston or anywhere else that wasn't Blackwater Plantation. Samuel stood alone, watching the fire consume everything. The main house collapsed in a shower of sparks. The slave quarters burned to their foundations, and finally, mercifully, the screaming vibrations from beneath the earth grew weaker and weaker until they stopped entirely. As dawn broke over the ruins of Blackwater Plantation, Samuel walked away. His feet carried him toward the rising sun, toward the east, toward freedom. He didn't know what he would find out there. He didn't know if the other slaves had survived their escape, or if Crane's creature had been the only one of its kind, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. His silence had saved him. The same curse that had made him unwanted, had turned him into property no one valued, had been his salvation. Because in a world where control came through sound, through the manipulation of what could be heard, the deaf man was free. Truly free. Not because chains had been broken, but because the chains had never been able to reach him in the first place. Samuel walked for days, following roads and paths that led away from the coast. He passed through towns where people stared at him with suspicion, through forests where the only sounds were the ones he felt through his feet. He ate when he could, slept when he had to, and kept moving toward some destination he couldn't name, but knew he would recognize when he found it. 3 weeks after the fire at Blackwater, Samuel reached Philadelphia. The city pulsed with life, with industry, with the vibrations of thousands of people living and working in close proximity. Samuel found work at a printing press, where his inability to hear was actually an advantage. The machinery was loud enough to damage hearing, the owner explained through gestures, but Samuel couldn't be damaged by what he couldn't hear. He worked there for 2 years, feeling the rhythm of the presses through the floor, learning to read the vibrations that meant a plate was misaligned or the paper was feeding incorrectly. He became valuable in a way he had never been as a slave, not despite his deafness, but because of it. During those years, Samuel heard stories, not heard them, but learned them through written words and gestures. Stories of other plantations where slaves had disappeared. Stories of places where people reported strange vibrations coming from the ground, where overseers reported slaves becoming docile to the point of catatonia. The thing at Blackwater hadn't been unique. It had been part of something larger, something that had learned to hide within the institution of slavery itself, using it as cover for experiments in control, in the suppression of human will. Samuel wrote letters to abolitionists, to newspaper editors, to anyone who would read them. He described what he had seen beneath Blackwater Plantation, though he knew most people would dismiss his account as madness or metaphor. But some believed, some understood that the greatest threat to human freedom wasn't just physical chains, but the invisible ones, the frequencies that could be used to control thoughts, to suppress resistance, to turn people into instruments of their own oppression. And Samuel knew something else, something he could feel in the vibrations that traveled through the city streets, through the foundations of buildings, through the very bones of the earth. The creatures that fed on slavery, that used it as a laboratory for their experiments in control, they were afraid. Afraid of people like him, people who couldn't be controlled. Afraid of fire and chaos, of anything that disrupted their carefully tuned systems. Afraid, most of all, of freedom itself, because freedom wasn't just the absence of chains, it was the presence of will, of choice, of the ability to resist, even when resistance seemed impossible. Samuel had been born into slavery, had been bought and sold like livestock, had been considered worthless because of his disability, but in the end, he had been the one person who could break the chains no one else could even see. He had been the one person who could feel the truth vibrating through the ground and choose to act on it, even when acting meant walking into hell itself. Years later, when the Civil War came and slavery was finally abolished, Samuel was still in Philadelphia. He was older now, his hair graying at the temples, his hands scarred from years of work. But he could still feel the vibrations, could feel the way the earth trembled when armies marched, when cannons fired, when the old order finally came crashing down. And sometimes, late at night, he would press his palm to the floor of his small apartment and feel something else. A reminder, a warning. The creatures that had fed on slavery hadn't disappeared. They had merely adapted, finding new ways to control, new frequencies to exploit. But Samuel knew their secret now. Knew that control, no matter how sophisticated, always had one weakness. There would always be someone who couldn't hear the commands, always someone immune to the frequency, always someone willing to strike the match and let the fire burn. The story of Blackwater Plantation became a legend among abolitionists, though the details were changed and softened over time. The deaf slave who burned down the plantation became a symbol, though most people who invoked his name didn't believe he was real. They thought he was metaphor, allegory, a story told to inspire courage in those who fought against slavery. But Samuel knew the truth. He had felt the fire vibrating through the ground, had felt the creature's death throes shaking the earth, had felt every slave who woke from their trance and ran toward freedom. He had felt it all, and he carried those vibrations with him every day, a reminder of what had been lost and what had been saved. In his final years, Samuel wrote his account of Blackwater, every detail he could remember. He described the chamber beneath the earth, the slaves standing in their alcoves like instruments in some terrible orchestra, the entity that had worn Thaddeus Crane's skin like a suit of clothes. He described the moment he understood that his curse was his salvation, that the silence he had lived with all his life had given him the one thing no one else at Blackwater possessed: immunity to the sounds of oppression. His manuscript was never published in his lifetime. Publishers found it too disturbing, too fantastical, too uncomfortable in its implications about what slavery had really been hiding. But copies circulated anyway, passed hand to hand among those who understood that the greatest horrors are the ones that hide in plain sight, that wear the mask of normalcy, that use existing systems of oppression as cover for something even darker. Samuel died in 1891, 43 years after the fire at Blackwater Plantation. He died in his sleep, in his own bed, in his own apartment, a free man in every sense that mattered. But before he died, he wrote one final message, pressed his palm to the floor of his room, and felt the vibrations of the world around him. He felt the footsteps of people walking freely on the streets above, felt the tremor of trains carrying people to destinations of their own choosing, felt the pulse of a city built on the promise of liberty. And beneath it all, faint but still present, he felt the echoes of those who had not escaped, the slaves who had stood too long in their alcoves, whose voices had been used for too many years, whose humanity had been extracted so thoroughly that there was nothing left to save. Their vibrations still echoed through the earth, a reminder that freedom, once stolen, is not easily recovered, that the scars of oppression run deeper than skin, deeper than memory, deeper than time itself. Samuel's final words, written in a shaking hand on the last page of his manuscript, were these: "I was born into a world that could not hear me, and that world made me its slave. But when I found myself in a place where hearing was a prison, my silence set me free. Freedom is not given and cannot be taken. It lives in the places beyond control, in the spaces where even the most sophisticated systems of oppression cannot reach. It lives in the deaf man who feels the fire through the ground, in the slave who looks into hell and chooses to light the match anyway. Remember Blackwater, remember what hides beneath the systems we build. And remember that the greatest chains are the ones we cannot see, the ones that vibrate at frequencies we think are natural, normal, necessary. Those are the chains that must be broken first."